September 2008, deep in the mountains of Uruzgan province, Afghanistan, an Australian SAS patrol found themselves in what one soldier later described as an absolute doozy of a shit fight. They were ambushed. 200 Taliban fighters opened up from the ridgelines surrounding Anakalai Valley. 9 Australians were wounded. An American Special Forces soldier was killed. The explosive detection dog, named Sarbi, bolted into the wilderness and would stay missing for 14 months. And somewhere in the chaos of that firefight, as Australian operators screamed coordinates into their radios, their American and Afghan allies heard something that sounded like English but made absolutely no sense. The Australians were calling for brass up support, reporting they were taking rounds from a position near the Dongas and requesting extraction before the whole situation went completely trapo. The Americans needed a translator, not from Pashto, not from Arabic, from Australian. This is the story of how the most geographically isolated Special Forces unit in NATO history accidentally created battlefield slang so impenetrable that their own allies sometimes had no idea what they were saying, and how that linguistic chaos became both a running joke and a genuine tactical advantage in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. If you're enjoying my videos, please like, subscribe, and comment what you want to see next. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment was never supposed to be different. When Major W. Gook marched a small group of soldiers into Campbell Barracks in the Perth suburb of Swanbourne on July 25, 1957, he was building a unit modeled directly on the British SAS. Same motto, same wing dagger badge, same philosophy of small team operations behind enemy lines. But Australia is 15,000 kilometers from London. The soldiers who volunteered for that first company came from a country that had been cooking its own linguistic stew for 150 years. The foundation was already there. Australian soldiers had been inventing their own military vocabulary since the trenches of Gallipoli in 1915, where they picked up Arabic words like imshi, meaning go away, and sayeda, meaning goodbye, from their time training in Egypt. They added French slang from the Western Front, transforming vin blanc into planque for cheap wine and tresban into bonzer for anything good. By World War II, these soldiers had developed such distinctive terminology that British and American forces sometimes needed glossaries. Water wagons manufactured by a company called Furphy became so associated with soldiers gathering around them to share rumors that Furphy became the Australian word for any unreliable information. The men who founded the SAS brought all of this baggage with them, and then they added more. In the jungles of Borneo in 1965, during secret cross-border operations against Indonesian forces, the Australian Special Air Service developed their first truly specialized combat vocabulary. They called their plastic sheet shelters hoochies, a word they borrowed from Japanese terms picked up during training exercises in the Pacific. They referred to reconnaissance as reese, which later confused British forces who called it recce, with a hard K sound. Small differences, but the first cracks in a wall that would grow much higher. Vietnam changed everything. When 3 Squadron deployed to Phi Tuy province in 1966, they entered a war already dominated by United States forces, United States equipment, and United States military terminology. The United States Army had standardized radio procedures, phonetic alphabet, and operational language across its entire force. Every soldier knew that Oscar Mike meant on the move, that Lima Charlie meant loud and clear, and that clicks meant kilometers. The Australians heard all of this and immediately started doing their own thing. The Viet Cong gave them the nickname Ma Rung, which translates to Phantoms of the Jungle, because Australian SAS patrols moved so quietly through the dense vegetation that enemy soldiers would sometimes walk directly into their ambush positions without ever sensing danger. In 6 years of operations, the Australian and New Zealand SAS conducted nearly 1,200 patrols and killed 492 confirmed enemy fighters while losing only 6 of their own men. It was the highest kill ratio of any unit in the entire war. But the American Special Forces soldiers who worked alongside them kept running into a different kind of problem. When Australian operators said they needed to go bush bash, Americans thought they were talking about some kind of Australian recreational activity. They were actually describing a jungle patrol, When Australians reported that a target was Buckley's, Americans had no idea the phrase meant no chance whatsoever. When patrol leaders said things were going pear-shaped, the meaning was clear enough, but the phrase had not entered American military vocabulary. And then there were words that meant completely opposite things. An American soldier hearing that his Australian counterpart had lucked out would assume good fortune. In Australian usage, lucking out means exactly the opposite. Your luck has run out. You are in trouble. Imagine the confusion when a patrol reported over radio that they had lucked out on enemy contact. The language gap grew wider. Australian soldiers developed specific terms for situations, equipment, and personnel that simply did not exist in American or British military vocabulary. They called their armored personnel carriers buckets, short for bucket of shit, because of how the vehicles handled in jungle terrain. They referred to officers with excessive brass on their uniforms as having bird shit on their shoulders. The M16 rifle became the black plastic fantastic. Enemy artillery positions were drop shorts, implying the gunners would probably hit their own troops. None of this was intentional encryption. It was just Australian soldiers being Australian. The really distinctive terms came from the specific culture of the SAS Regiment itself. Members who passed selection wore the sandy-colored beret and became known as blades, a reference to the flaming sword on their badge. Non-SAS personnel posted to the regiment were called black hats. The brutal physical selection course, where candidates are pushed beyond exhaustion while being deliberately sleep-deprived and disoriented, was simply called the bag. Getting bagged meant something very specific to SAS soldiers and had nothing to do with being captured. When these operators deployed to East Timor in 1999 as part of the International Intervention Force, they found themselves working alongside troops from Portugal, New Zealand, Thailand, the Philippines, and a dozen other countries. The communication challenges multiplied. Australian patrol commanders would radio that they were going to give it a burl, meaning attempt something, and receive confused silence in response. They would describe enemy positions as being chockers, meaning full of fighters, and watch Allied forces miss the meaning entirely. They would report that a situation was full as a goog, an old Australian phrase comparing something to a completely filled egg, and get requests to repeat the report in standard military terminology. But the real test came in Afghanistan, when one squadron of the Australian Special Air Service landed at Forward Operating Base Rhino in December 2001. They became one of the first special operations units on the ground in the entire coalition campaign. They were immediately attached to American Marine Task Force 58 and began conducting long-range vehicle patrols across hundreds of kilometers of territory around Kandahar. The Australians were hunting for Osama bin Laden. American intelligence believed he was moving south through the mountain passes. Australian patrols would screen the escape routes, watching for any sign of high-value targets. During one operation in early 2002, an Australian patrol spotted a group of fighters in the mountains who appeared to be protecting an older man in white robes carrying a cane. The Australians called in the contact using their own terminology, describing the target as looking like the big enchilada, a phrase they had picked up from American movies but were using in a way that confused the Americans on the radio net. American intelligence initially believed the man was bin Laden himself. It later turned out to be his second-in-command, Ayman al-Zawahiri. An airstrike was called in, but there was never confirmation of whether it succeeded. The confusion over exactly what the Australians had seen and how they had described it became a minor point of contention in after-action reports. Over the next decade, as Australian Special Operations Forces rotated through Afghanistan continuously, the language barrier became a persistent background issue. The Australian Special Operations Task Group worked alongside American Green Berets, British SAS, Dutch Special Forces, and the elite units of a dozen other NATO countries. Each nation brought its own military vocabulary, but the Australians were uniquely difficult to understand. The problem was not just slang, it was the entire rhythm of Australian speech. Australians shorten words that other English speakers leave long. Afternoon becomes arvo, breakfast becomes brekkie, ammunition becomes ammo everywhere. but only Australians turned barbecue into Barbie, compensation into compo, and registration into rego. This tendency extended into military terminology in ways that confused Allied forces. Document becomes doco, reconnaissance becomes reese, interrogation becomes terp, or int, depending on who was speaking. And then there were the phrases that made perfect sense in Australia and none whatsoever anywhere else. When an Australian soldier said something was a piece of piss, he meant it was easy. When he said he was buggered, he meant exhausted. When he described a colleague as a dag, he was being affectionate about someone socially awkward. When he called someone a drongo, he was not being affectionate at all. These distinctions were clear to any Australian, but completely opaque to American, British, or European forces. In 2019, ahead of joint exercises with U.S. Marines rotating through Darwin, Australian military officials were so concerned about communication problems that they issued statements cautioning soldiers about the potential for misunderstanding. Group Captain Stuart Dowry, Deputy Commander of Australia's Northern Command, told Australian media that the time to figure out translation problems is not on the battlefield, when the bullets are flying. Media outlets initially reported incorrectly that Australian soldiers had been banned from using slang around Americans. The Australian Defence Force quickly corrected the story, clarifying that soldiers were simply being reminded that phrases like lucked out, crack the shits, and she'll be right might need explanation for Allied personnel who did not grow up in Sydney or Melbourne. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. While the linguistic confusion created genuine operational problems in joint exercises and coalition operations, it also created something else entirely. The Australian Special Air Service, the SAS, had accidentally developed a communication system that was very difficult for enemies to understand, even when they intercepted radio transmissions. Taliban and Al-Qaeda forces in Afghanistan made extensive efforts to monitor coalition radio communications. They captured equipment, recruited translators, and developed signals intelligence capabilities that were often surprisingly sophisticated. Decoding American military communications required understanding specific terminology and procedures, but the basic language was accessible to anyone who spoke English. Australian transmissions were different. Enemy monitors who had learned to interpret American military radio chatter found themselves baffled by Australian patrols reporting that they were in a bit of a sticky wicket, that enemy forces had gone walkabout, or that the whole operation had turned into a proper dog's breakfast. These phrases were not code words. They were not deliberate encryption. They were simply how Australians talked. The effect was similar to the Navajo code talkers of World War II, except completely unintentional. Australian military slang, forged over a century of isolation and refinement in the most geographically remote English-speaking country on Earth, had become functionally unbreakable to anyone who had not grown up immersed in the culture. Intelligence analysts noted this phenomenon, but they never formalized it. You cannot train operators to speak authentically in slang they did not learn naturally. The linguistic security was a byproduct of Australian culture, not a deliberate military capability. It was an accidental advantage. The Australians kept adding to their vocabulary. Operations in Iraq introduced new terms. Operations in the Solomon Islands added others. Each deployment brought contact with new allied forces, new enemies, and new situations that required new words. By the 2010s, the Australian military slang lexicon had grown so large that Wiktionary maintained a dedicated appendix listing hundreds of terms, many of them specific to the SAS and other special operations units. Some terms were self-deprecating. Australian soldiers referred to their own headquarters staff as cake and arse party, implying disorganization. They called their medical officers scab lifters. They described pointless bureaucratic exercises as dog and pony shows, though Americans used the same phrase with slightly different connotations. Some terms were specific to the SAS experience. The brutal training where candidates are psychologically broken down was the bag. The counterterrorism unit maintained on permanent standby was TAG, which stands for Tactical Assault Group. Operators qualified in every specialty were double-hatted. Those who struggled were described as being broken dick, and some terms remain classified, known only to those who have served. The linguistic identity of the Australian SAS became inseparable from the operational identity. To speak like a blade was to be a blade. The slang was not just communication, it was culture, history, and belonging compressed into shorthand that outsiders could not easily penetrate. In 2009, during the Battle of Kaz, Oregon, Trooper Mark Donaldson performed actions that would earn him the Victoria Cross for Australia, the first awarded since the Vietnam War. During the ambush that wounded 9 Australians, Donaldson deliberately drew enemy fire to allow wounded colleagues to escape, then ran across open ground under Taliban machine guns to rescue a wounded Afghan interpreter. The radio transmissions during that firefight have never been fully released. Soldiers who were there described the chaos of Australian voices, calling for support in terminology that American and Afghan forces sometimes struggled to immediately parse. In the heat of combat, the Australians fell back on the language they knew best, the language they had grown up with, the language that had been forged across decades of operations in the world's most remote and dangerous places. When Donaldson later described the battle, he used words that any Australian would understand instantly and that anyone else would need a moment to translate. The Dutch forces, who were supposed to provide quick reaction support to the Australian and American patrol that day, did not arrive. The relationship between Dutch and Australian forces in Uruzgan province was complicated, and the reasons for the delayed response remain controversial. Australian soldiers who were there later said they felt abandoned, using language considerably more colorful than anything that would appear in official reports. The SAS soldier, Rob Mailer, who was wounded during the battle, later told reporters that the Australians had pleaded with the Dutch using exactly the kind of slang that defined their unit. They described themselves as being in an absolute doozy of a shit fight, a phrase that communicates urgency, desperation, and the dark humor that Special Forces operators use to survive impossible situations. Whether the Dutch fully understood what they were hearing remains unclear. After the battle, the explosive detection dog Sarbi was missing. She had been terrified by a rocket explosion and bolted into the Afghan wilderness. The Australians searched for her, but eventually had to extract. For 14 months, Sarbi survived in Taliban-controlled territory, somehow evading both the enemy and the harsh Afghan winter. She was finally recovered when an American soldier noticed her accompanying a local Afghan man and recognized the distinctive markings. The man had apparently found her wandering and kept her as a companion, not knowing that half the Australian Special Operations community had been looking for her. Sarbi was flown back to Tarin Kowt, where SAS handlers confirmed her identity. She was later awarded the RSPCA Purple Cross and became one of the most famous military dogs in Australian history. Even Prime Minister Kevin Rudd mentioned her recovery in Parliament. The story captured something about the Australian SAS that the language alone could not convey. They were relentless. They never forgot their own. They operated with a combination of professionalism and larrikin humor that confused allies and enemies alike. In 2011, Corporal Ben Roberts Smith was awarded the Victoria Cross for an action in Tizak, where he single-handedly neutralized 2 Taliban machine gun positions, exposing himself to fire multiple times to save his patrol. The citation described his actions in formal military language, the kind that could be understood by any English speaker anywhere in the world. But the soldiers who served with him described what happened in very different terms. They talked about how he went trapo on the enemy, how he did not blink when things went pear-shaped, how he was a proper hard bastard in the best possible meaning of those words. This was the voice of the Australian Special Air Service, SAS. Not the official statements or the formal citations, but the language they used among themselves. The language had evolved across decades of operations in Borneo, Vietnam, East Timor, Iraq, and Afghanistan. It was the vocabulary of shared hardship and practical humor, full of turns of phrase that meant more to the regiment than any formal dispatch could convey. In 2013, Special Operations Command Australia received its first battle honor since the Vietnam War. It was awarded for the Shah Wali Kot Offensive of 2010, recognizing the actions of the SAS and the 2nd Commando Regiment during some of the heaviest fighting Australian forces had seen in decades. The formal announcement used standard military terminology, but somewhere in the barracks at Swanbourne, or at forward operating bases that had become temporary homes for Australian operators. Soldiers were describing the honor in their own words. They were probably being modest about it, because that was the culture. They were probably making jokes, because that was also the culture. And they were almost certainly using language that would have required translation for anyone who was not themselves a blade. Australia remained one of the largest non-NATO contributors to operations in Afghanistan until the international withdrawal. Over 26,000 Australian personnel served there across 2 decades. 41 were killed in action. Hundreds more were wounded. The physical and psychological costs of that long war are still being counted, but the linguistic legacy persisted. Today, when Australian Special Forces train with American SEALs, British SAS, or any other allied unit, the language question remains. Standard operating procedures and official communications use internationalized military terminology that everyone can understand. But the moment Australians start talking among themselves, the vocabulary shifts. They still call their patrol shelters hoochies. They still describe difficult situations as being sticky wickets. They still use phrases that their grandfathers invented in the trenches of France and their fathers refined in the jungles of Vietnam. The language has become heritage, a living connection to every generation of Australian soldier who came before. Whether this is an operational problem or an operational asset depends entirely on who you ask. The enemies who tried to intercept Australian communications found them nearly impossible to decode. The allies who tried to understand them in the heat of battle sometimes missed critical information. The military planners who wanted standardized procedures across coalition forces never fully succeeded in getting Australians to abandon their linguistic identity. And the operators themselves never saw any reason to change. They were the phantoms of the jungle, the blades, the men who had earned their sandy berets through the brutal selection process that most candidates failed. They spoke the language of their regiment, their country, and their history. If the rest of the world could not always understand them, well, that was the rest of the world's problem. The Australian Special Air Service, SAS, did not set out to create unbreakable battlefield slang. They were just being Australian. But in a conflict environment where information security was increasingly difficult to maintain, where enemies grew more sophisticated in their surveillance capabilities, and where encrypted communications could be compromised, the organic linguistic barrier they had accidentally constructed proved more durable than any code. It was not strategic, it was not planned, it was the natural result of a century of Australian military culture developing in isolation from the rest of the English-speaking world. And for the soldiers who served in the Australian Special Air Service, it was simply how they talked. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, there is another video on your screen now about other SAS operations that inspired the Australian Regiment. Click it to continue the journey. And if you made it this far, subscribe. We cover stories like this every week.